Good evening. I'm Smita Das. I am the chair of the Professional Education Committee of NCPS and president-elect. And I'm really excited to be introducing tonight's webinar. This is our inaugural webinar on climate change and mental health, a psychiatric primer, presented by Dr. Trope and Dr. Cooper. I will introduce them in a moment. The activity is providing CME credit, and you will be able to get that credit once this presentation is over. In the coming days, there will be an email with instructions on how to get the CME credit. There are a few learning objectives put forth by our instructors today. Participants should be able to identify 3 major impacts of climate change on mental health. They should be able to identify specific impacts of heat on psychiatric functioning and risks of psychiatric patients. And they should be able to identify particular vulnerable populations at risk for mental health impacts of climate change. We're particularly lucky that this inaugural webinar is happening today, Earth Day, and we're very excited again that you all could join us today. I also wanted to let everybody know about our next CME event. It is scheduled for June 8th, 2019 in the afternoon in Cupertino, California. We had a lot of requests from our membership to have events in different places around the Bay Area, so we're excited to have this particular one in the South Bay. And this is an American Psychiatric Association and TCPI sponsored event, which is training in integrated and collaborative care for psychiatrists. So a very hot topic in psychiatry right now, collaborative care, and a lot of different district branches are presenting this particular program. And we're very excited and lucky that the American Psychiatric Association will be having representatives here for NCPS to offer this event. It will also offer CME 4 hours through the APA. There's a link at the bottom there of your screen, and it'll come through your email as well to go ahead for more information and to register. But if you go to ncps.org and click on events, generally you can see all of our upcoming events. So we're really excited also to have this platform to do a webinar on. A little bit of housekeeping. So we have all of our participants muted. And so the way that you're going to ask questions throughout this event is by using the Q&A box. And there's a screenshot there. There's a Q&A button that you have on your screen. And you can type your question in there and then click send, and that'll broadcast it to everybody else so we can see it. And if there's a question that's already been asked that you like and you want it to be asked of our speakers this evening, then please go ahead and try to like it with the thumbs up, and that way we'll know that that question has extra attention and extra interest when we're trying to sort through the questions at the end of the event and choose which ones we'll have time to go over. Great. So on this Earth Day, I'm really glad to introduce our 2 speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Alex Trope. He is in psychiatry at UCSF. He studied international development with a focus on global health at Brown and continued to work on global health at Partners in Health thereafter. And he then went to medical school at UCSF, UC Berkeley Joint Medical Program. There he completed a Master's of Science and undertook a group randomized controlled trial of classroom-based yoga and mindfulness curriculum for inner city youth. During medical school, he also took a year off to pursue his interest in writing, climate change, and alternative models of development, and was picked to be a UC Carbon Neutrality Initiative Fellow from 2015 to 16. There, he engaged the UCSF community in discussions of health providers' roles in preventing and mitigating the effects of climate change and on human health, and orchestrated a 2-day student-run climate and health conference called Earth Health 1. In addition to all of that, he is a member of the steering committee of Climate Psychiatry Alliance. He is currently splitting his professional time between clinical duties as a PGY3 resident and group therapy research using psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy through the UCSF Bonding and Attunement in Neuropsychiatric Disorders BAND Lab. His email's there if you have follow-up questions for after the talk, and we're really glad that he's joining us to present this evening. Our other speaker is Dr. Robin Cooper. She's a San Francisco psychiatrist who has had a private practice for over 35 years and is on the voluntary faculty appointment at UCSF Department of Psychiatry. And she's worn many different hats over her career. She's previously even served on council of NCPS. She's always had a deep commitment to using her voice on issues of advocacy for social and health justice. She served as the California Psychiatric Association's state representative to State Mental Health Coalition, advocating with our legislative director, Randall Hager, on protecting services for the severely mentally ill. She has been deeply distressed and involved with issues of climate change and the profound threats this entails. As such, she co-founded with other concerned psychiatrists the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, a group dedicated to understanding, educating, and advocating about the specific impact of climate change on mental health. And we're really glad Dr. Cooper is with us. Both Dr. Trope and Dr. Cooper have a great deal of knowledge and wisdom in this area, and so they're wonderful experts to be bringing us this webinar this evening. And with that, I'm going to hand the discussion off to Dr. Trope.
Actually, I'm going to start that, but Alex is going to bring the slides up for us. And I want to underscore and say how excited we are to talk about this. Dr. Doss has already indicated that today is Earth Day. And actually, today is the countdown to next year's 50th anniversary of that first day, April 22nd, 1970. Which was created with launching the modern environmental movement. And the organization has sustained its commitment to educate and advocate for protecting our worldwide environment and grown in its participation and impact. So we felt it was appropriate to bring this new beginning NCPS webinar series on Earth Day to the discussion, which is considered to be the worst public health risk to the world population of the 21st century. But it also represents the greatest public health opportunity to turn the tides, and that is the impact of climate change on health. Those impacts on health are well documented, but the impacts on mental health are equally severe and are less understood and known. In fact, the psychic toll may be more penetrating, since as humans, we all experience the world through our emotions. And that is what we're going to be focusing on today. Next slide. But neither Alex nor I have any financial or relationships to disclose. However, I want to reiterate, which has already been said, that we're both members of the steering committee of Climate Psychiatry Alliance, a group that is dedicated to understanding, educating, and advocating about the climate change impacts on mental health. You want to go? So this is going to be a pretty rapid overview. There's a lot of material, and there's references available, and also a lot of material on our Climate Psychiatry Alliance website. So this is going to be a pretty broad sweep. It's a primer, but we've organized the main impacts on mental health of climate change into a number of domains. And those you see: acute disasters, slow-moving disasters, extreme heat, eco-anxiety, vulnerable populations. And then we hope to end on an up note of what you can do. Next slide, please. So, let's start with acute disasters. Those kinds of climate-related impacts that occur within days or months. And those are superstorms, floods, wildfires. These are the things that make hot news. And Paradise in Northern California is our closest example. And I think we've all had experiences in some way about what happened in Paradise, and I actually call Paradise now non-Paradise. It is fairly well understood that severe disasters can cause anxiety, post-traumatic stress response, depression, and suicidalities. These responses can be both time limited, or they can be extended over time. They can be acute, or they can be delayed. The impacts of severe loss of life, death to family, interruption or loss of employment and property loss, loss of housing, displacement and migrations from the community, loss of community supports, the breakdown of social structures, all have serious implications for mental health and are part of acute disasters. Alex has put up this slide. This is a very typical time frame of phases for any disaster, not just climate disasters, but is related to those climate disasters that we are seeing more and more. I want to call your attention to that early heroic phase. This is when we see those kind of TV reported of heroes saving people. These early and heroic efforts can be understood psychodynamically as effective protective defenses of reaction formation and dissociation during acute crises. That follows with the honeymoon phase, and it continues when communities bind together and support each other, and there's a great sense of togetherness. We're going to get through this together. We also see this on news reports, but as the news cycle it moves on, and as the grim and persistent reality of the destruction and loss become apparent after these early periods, these early defenses can give way to profound and complex states of hopelessness, helplessness, and disillusionment. And that disillusionment can be intensified by slow bureaucratic responses to real needs that communities have. Now, if we follow this, this trajectory, the graph kind of implies that there's that it's heading toward resolution and health. I'm not sure that that's always true. I think that that's a more hopeful outcome, and this is not what happens for many of the most severely impacted. Next slide. But fortunately, for many exposed to those acute disasters, those early acute distress symptoms are very prominent for many people. Symptoms of anxiety, irritability, distraction, insomnia are pervasive, but resolve spontaneously and require no ongoing care for many people. However, there is an increase in risky behavior for people who are experiencing acute disasters. And there's an increase in alcohol and drug use, and also for burnout, particularly from some of those early heroes. But then there is another significant group of people who are at severe risk for enduring difficulties. Again, people who have sustained the most severe losses are at greater risk and are vulnerable to what we call more complex traumas, and have more enduring symptoms, more significant symptoms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And as I've already kind of said, I think that the Paradise survivors in our most recent fire are going to have enduring difficulties. This was the most severe wildfire in California history. And that entire community has been destroyed, endured huge financial losses with minimal means to recover. And almost everyone is displaced and dispersed. So I anticipate that there will be more significant ongoing difficulties for that population. Next slide. So the literature on post-traumatic stress is extensive, and it supports concerns for both the early acute symptoms and delayed onset of emotional symptoms. Hurricane Katrina is now considered kind of ground zero for what we understand as climate disasters. I want to call your attention to the pictures on the left side. The kids there are children in the evacuation centers and in Katrina. The bottom is a man trudging through the flooding. I want to put some of this in some ideas of some of the statistical data that has accumulated out of Hurricane Katrina. Over 30% of New Orleans metro residents who remained in New Orleans after the hurricane had acute post-traumatic stress. 62% of evacuees from the hurricane met the criteria for acute stress disorder. These are huge populations. There was an increase in suicide and a suicide ideation following Katrina, and often this was delayed with spikes in suicide 6 months after Katrina. 44% of the population of New Orleans had not returned to their city for the entire year following Katrina. And 40,000 African Americans resettled in Houston, never to return. And that area of Houston was called the New Orleans diaspora. Those people were re-traumatized during Hurricane Harvey. The pictures on the right are pictures of Paradise and what we experienced there. So and as I said, those are important things that I think will become more problematic. We have not focused enough attention on the collapse, either temporarily or permanently, of the healthcare delivery system in areas hit by disasters. Every significant climate disaster has faced the need to evacuate hospitals, clinics, closure and collapse of the delivery systems. In fact, in New Orleans, the psychiatric patients who were hospitalized on the locked wards of the top floors of Charity Hospital were trapped and staged their own evacuation, bursting out of the locked wards. And their story is worthy of a Hollywood motion picture drama. Charity Hospital in New Orleans, which had been one of the oldest public hospital in the United States, begun the same year as Bellevue in New York City, never opened again and was been replaced by a system of services. I want to also state that Bellevue closed during Superstorm Sandy, and patients had to be evacuated. The damage to the hospital infrastructure, plus the exodus of medical and professional and psychiatric professionals, the workforce in these devastated areas, puts a much greater impact on the ability to provide services to people when there is a much greater need. There are now over 400 hospitals that are located in flood zones alone. Next slide. I'm going to turn this over to Alex, who's going to talk about slow-moving disasters.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, this is a continuum between acute and slow. So there are a threshold between these things. Sea level rise is a continuum with ocean surges, which occur during storms. Air pollution can both have an acute effect, as we saw with the Paradise disaster, and the worst air quality levels that were anywhere in the world were happening in the Bay Area for weeks. And drought and heat waves also have some overlap, but we distinguish these because these really are the impacts and the effects that are felt over months, years, and decades, that have similarity with some of the acute disasters, but actually have a psychological and physiological and environmental toll that is all their own and crosses social, demographic, economic, and emotional terrain. So we chose these three, drought, sea level rise, and air pollution, but there's, of course, a host of long, slow-moving disasters. Kind of climate change has been called that generally. Climate change is just a pattern it's not actually a thing. That's one of the difficulties of talking about it. It's Robin and I often like to call it a risk amplifier. Droughts were known all across the world before we started increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but now the risk from them and the likelihood of their occurring is much greater. And judging from these photos, all the way from many of reservoirs that were drawn down to crisis levels in Northern California, to people in the global South having to deal with their subsistence or basic farming being completely taken away from them, ranchers throughout the world, and sources of economic prosperity. You know, here are some vineyards that had to be turned over basically to a new dust bowl in California. And, you know, I think this is especially important for thinking about those people that are most connected with the land, which health professionals oftentimes, because we're not running farms or have a basic livelihood that depends on direct relationship with land. It's hard to know how deeply affecting the drought could be. For me, the recent California drought that we just got over this year in all our counties was deeply unsettling, but I still got my food. I was still able to make my employment work. So I can only imagine the level of distress that comes in when it's a daily reality. And then air pollution. This is a huge issue that expands way beyond greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's important because climate change, while it's usually just associated with CO2 and oftentimes not even a step past that towards other greenhouse gases, all these environmental sources that release fossil fuel emissions often release other very toxic, harmful chemicals into the air. And we have very little regulation. If we were just dumping these things into a water reserve, I think that would cause immediate distress and we would have some ownership over that. But the fact that it gets dispersed into a global atmosphere makes accountability and responsibility much different. You can see all these sources here, from oil production to agriculture to landfills. And you can see how that relates to various volatile chemicals that are released, small particulate matter, anything from formaldehyde to hydrofluorocarbons. And that's important to know because methane is actually a very potent but shorter-lived greenhouse gas that we can make an immediate impact on if we could get methane emissions sources under control. The same goes for, we see hydrofluoric acid here, but hydrofluorocarbons, which are used in refrigerants, are a hugely potent greenhouse gas, and we could have immediate impact by them by changing to other alternate sources for refrigeration that are not greenhouse gases. And then lastly, we want to talk about toxicity of air pollution. Most people have seen movies or know just from their training that air pollution is connected to a variety of cancers, asthma, heart attacks, fertility issues, intrauterine growth restriction, and these have been proven time and time again with communities that live near either air polluting industrial processes or highways. There's an evolving notion of brain pollution, which is now beginning to be understood at a physiological level through both animal models and human experiments that shows that even if something isn't expressly a volatile chemical that we know will interact, just having small particulate matter at the level of PM 2.5 micrometers, it can get directly into the central nervous system through the cribriform plate of your cranium and up through the olfactory bulb. It can also go directly into your alveoli. And this creates a general neuroinflammatory state that can have a host of downstream effects that we don't completely understand the mechanism for, but has been connected to ADHD, developmental delay, autism, Parkinson's, stroke, dementia. And it's riding on the coattails of this general move towards understanding more of the neuroinflammatory contributions to mental illness. Lastly, sea level rise is kind of the Trojan horse of climate change. It's the thing that comes in shortly, that comes in subtly, that we are always waiting for, yet it's hard to recognize the way that it's already impacting communities. But if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a picture of Miami-Dade County, the most vulnerable sea level rise county in the United States, according to this map, that would have, at least in this century, almost 2 million people at direct risk of dislocation or displacement because of encroaching sea level. And a lot of other counties in Florida. I want to draw your attention to the 7th on that list, which is San Mateo County, which a lot of people don't recognize. A lot of that was marshland, was meant to actually have an ebb and flow of tidal waters, but we've taken away many of the marshland protections that we had, and now this is a very at-risk community with up to 250,000 people at risk this century of dislocation if we can't change the curve on greenhouse gases. Some activists put these markers at Coyote Point, which is a park just south of SFO, to show where the sea level will be in 2030, 2050, and 2100. And that's just mid-range tidal range, not king tide or other things that can directly affect people as they already are in Miami-Dade. And then it will just accelerate processes that are somewhat natural and that we put ourselves at risk because we haven't worked with the natural instability in the land. But Pacifica, which is already experiencing erosion into the sea, that kind of sea level rise will just accelerate that, and more huge buildings like this will have to be shuttered and either broken down or will fall into the ocean, as they have done in certain rainy seasons in the past.
So I'm going to talk about the impacts on extreme heat. No doubt we know that the world is heating up. We're experiencing it here, even in San Francisco, where we have our built-in air conditioning of the Pacific Ocean. Extreme heat is here. It's going to stay. It's become the new norm. And increases in baseline heat during these more and more frequent heat waves cause a wide range of mood, behavioral, and cognitive impacts that are especially pertinent to psychiatry. And I'm going to focus on some of the most prominent and concerning. Next slide. So extreme heat makes all of us, most of us, cranky. We have more temper flares. We feel listless. And our colloquial language expresses this when we speak about being hot-headed, simmering anger, I'm so angry, my blood boils, and the admonition to chill out. Hey, cool it, man. But extreme heat goes way beyond crankiness, with significant effects on mental health and behavior. And this is, I think, especially important for those who have fragile and erratic impulse controls already. Scientific evidence has substantiated this general understanding with data showing that actually one standard deviation in increased temperatures over the norm in a community contributes to a 4% increase in interpersonal violence. And I think this has very particular concern for domestic violence and abuse of women and children. And I heard on the radio today that of women who have been involved in violence, death occurs 50% of the time through some interpersonal violence done by a partner. So I think this impacts children and women very significantly. That same 1 degree increase in temperature with standard deviation also has a 14% increase in intergroup violence. And given the state of our world, where there are skirmishes and political fights throughout the world, this is of great concern. This is a worldwide phenomenon and happening everywhere. Next slide. Suicide is a form of violence, a kind of violence turned inward. And there have been a number of reported papers that have seen the link between suicide and increased heat. I think that there's a very important paper that just came out, research group out of Stanford, that reported that 1 degree centigrade increase over the monthly average temperature increases the risk of suicide in the United States by 0.7%, and in Mexico by 2.1%. This group who did the research out of Stanford, I think, have added to the literature enormously, because although understanding suicide is a complex mixture of many different variables, they were able to tease out the very specific impact of heat alone. So this is a very profound piece of information. And they project that there will be in the range, and it's a wide range as the slide shows, but an additional 21,000 additional suicides due to heat alone by 2015, unless we do something to change that curve of increasing heat. These rates are comparable to the effects on suicide in incidents due to economic recessions and unemployment, and rival the reductions in gun restriction laws and suicide prevention programs. That same study looked at the amount of depressive language and suicide thoughts communicated on social media and saw increases during heat waves. Next slide. Now, our impact on the ability to think is also something that we kind of have a sense about. It's just too hot to think. I just can't think about that. But again, the scientific evidence supports this, these impacts on cognitive function. Extreme heat has had an impact on attention and reduced reaction times at heat exposed places of work, and has huge implications for work performance, productivity, and worker safety. Complex cognitive tasks such as working memory measured by spatial span and pattern recognition tests are also significantly impaired during heat stress. The elderly are particularly impacted with impaired working memory and executive function difficulties during heat stress. And lastly, a new report that students at Harvard who live in air-conditioned dorms fared significantly better on exams than students in non-air-conditioned dorms during a 10-day heat wave. So I suggest it's good to get a good dorm room. Next slide. Our psychiatric medications are a particular concern, since most of the medications in our psychiatric pharmacopoeia have the potential to interfere with the body's normal heat and fluid regulatory mechanisms. Antipsychotics, some antidepressants, and anti-Parkinsonian drugs interfere with heat regulation and the body's normal protective mechanism of sweating, which is the primary mechanism for cooling. Photosensitivity can be a side effect of antipsychotics and other medications which risk severe sunburn and heat stroke. Lithium levels can rise with excess fluid loss through sweating and dehydration, and risk dangerous or toxic blood levels. Signs of heat exhaustion and lithium toxicity can go unnoticed and unrecognized. This is particularly important for psychiatric providers to know about and educate and protect our patients. Alex is going to talk about the next chapter.
Yeah, so this is, as we said, a primer, and this is a particularly large subject since it's really the outset of a larger group of people discussing this idea of the anxieties and different psychological reactions that can occur to the knowledge of climate change or the direct effects of ecological degradation. Some people on this call have probably seen in popular press either climate anxiety, eco-anxiety, climate grief. It's being written about more and more from a journalistic side, but these aren't standardized DSM diagnoses, nor should they be, but they're very helpful tools for recognizing what's actually happening in the room. They're often now housed under this rubric of psychoterratic syndrome, simply the idea that your psychology and the terra firma, Earth, can interact and create kind of new novel forms of distress that are showing up in in treatment rooms throughout the world. And I'll just put up here a few names that you might come across. I'm not going to actually define all of them. A simple web search would give you a sense for how people are using it in a non-standardized way, but I do want to go into two of these bubbles in particular. The first one is psychic defenses that are used. These are not particular to climate distress, but there has been some great writing about them. So if anyone wanted to learn more about these aspects, I would direct you to the edited edition by Sally Weintraub, a Kleinian psychoanalyst in London, that brings together a lot of her colleagues to discuss how people engage or disengage from climate change. And they specifically try to chunk down and define what climate denial versus climate disavowal is, versus climate acceptance and other pieces of object relationships within that. And then this other book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, was very impactful, written by a Nordic kind of scholar, more a sociologist, and actually someone with a marketing background, so really understands what messaging can do. And perhaps in Stokes, the author gives this pyramid that you see on the bottom left of 6 Ds that kind of have to filter that a climate message, any particular climate message, from a UN panel to a pundit online to your uncle telling you something, they have to go through both first distance, how psychologically or temporally distant you feel from the impacts of climate change, then doom scenarios, which are often activated quite acutely by the way that the climate messages are portrayed in the media, because they know that will get clicks, initial clicks, but it often leaves people feeling completely disengaged. Then this cognitive dissonance of recognizing that most people, almost all people, especially if they're living an American lifestyle, have a very large carbon footprint, yet they feel distress around what has already occurred due to these processes and what is to come. Then lastly, actually closer to getting this to really stick, is denial. And Weintraub and colleagues also describe this. Climate denial we often think of as larger think tanks that are trying to put out messages of doubt or misinformation, but there's always a protective source within people. And it finally has to impact your identity. You have to see yourself as a nature lover, as a humanist, as something that really connects with why you care about an invisible substance in the sky that we haven't had to interact with much in our evolution as a species. And that's the last D, which is really identity. And that's the hardest one to give up if you're from a political or regional group or area that is strongly associated with climate denialism or skepticism. It's going to be very hard for you to get through that final filter. Then 2 other pieces that I wanted to describe. The first one here on the left is this great work by Glenn Albrecht, a scholar out of Australia, who coined the term solastalgia after doing a variety of interviews with ranchers and farmers in New South Wales province during multiple Australian droughts. And this is a description of a melancholy or homesickness experienced while an individual is already at their home, but feels separated from the quality or assurance that it used to provide. Droughts are a very important part of this, because literally the ground from under you changes in color, in variety, in textures. And for those who have to rely on their livelihood for it, you see it in your pocketbook and you see it in your ability to provide for your family and community. Secondly, I think on a more hopeful tone, there's a new book out by a great, also synthetic scholar, Charles Eisenstein, called Climate: A New Story. And this really asks that identity piece, the 6th D, what compels us to engage with a pretty cognitively taxing idea that there's an invisible substance that is not toxic in and of itself, that's actually key to life, carbon dioxide, that now feels like a threat. And he calls that carbon reductionism, that we can actually best engage with climate change by recognizing the underlying ecosystems that both can moderate the overall impact of climate change. Marshlands down in San Mateo County, if they were more present, sea level rise would not be as much of a threat to dislocation of that population, and gets at the underlying felt and real connection with land, its species, water, its species, that often compels people into environmental action. And then lastly, I want to direct you to another steering committee member from Climate Psychiatry Alliance, Janet Lewis, who's a practicing psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, has written a two-part piece called "In the Room with Climate Anxiety" for the Psychiatric Times. And what she asks, and what I think I would compel anyone on this webinar to do, is simply try asking a patient, maybe with generalized anxiety, try to see, do you ever worry about climate change? And do that very non-judgmentally. You don't want to politicize the room, but that could be a concern, just like people are attuned to ask about gun violence triggers when there's another mass shooting in the media. That can be something to ask, and we would love to hear about your experiences with that. We are collecting more and more patient vignettes because it actually is a pretty sensitive question. Pick up and differentiate between someone who's just genuinely interacting with the knowledge of climate change and how huge it is versus someone who's moved into a more kind of pathological relationship where it's become subsumed by their generalized anxiety or their OCD. And that's a really important differentiation to make in your treatment plan for them.
So I'm going to go on and talk about who is impacted by climate change. And I will suggest that every single one of us is and will be and already is affected by what's happening in our world and about climate change. Alex has also already mentioned disavowal, that kind of sense, where I sometimes live, that it's happening, I know it, I'm very, very attuned to climate change, but I'm going to be okay. And I think that that's a place for many of us. But I want to remind you, every one of us will be affected by climate change, but we are not affected equally. There are very particular groups that are much more at risk than, and the impacts are not equally distributed. Next slide. We know that the most vulnerable populations for the differential impacts of climate change are children, the elderly, especially frail elderly, first responders, people who work have to be outside to work, that is farm workers or construction workers, people who live close to the land, pregnant women and newly postpartum women, and the homeless and the seriously mentally ill. Additionally, if you look at the picture on the far right, kids who play sports, those youth athletes, are at particular risk for impacts. The mentally ill and the homeless mentally ill are particularly at risk. Alex, thank you. And the facts bear out this particular vulnerability for psychiatric patients. Psychiatric patients have an increase in emergency room visits and hospitalizations during heat waves over a non-psychiatric population. Pre-existing mental illness alone, on its own, triples the risk of mortality during heat extremes. I'm going to repeat that. Our patients die 3 times more than others during heat waves. The reasons for this huge disparity in morbidity and mortality are a complex mixture of social factors. The illness characteristics, the differential rates of substance abuse, poor coping skills, social isolation, and the impacts, of course, as I've already mentioned, of psychiatric medications. Social factors of poverty, substandard housing, or homelessness, with the inability to access air conditioning or safe, cool environments, or find reprieve from extreme heat exposure, often coexist with the severe mental illness. These are what we call the social determinants of health and are considered multipliers of negative health and mental health outcomes and contribute to this increased vulnerability of the mentally ill to the impact of extreme heat. So as I've said, our population are extremely vulnerable. Unusually high temperatures, which represent the risks for our patients, are especially true for the severe psychotic or mood disorders, or people with substance abuse disorders and pre-existing cognitive impairments. Patients who can compensate with marginal executive functioning during normal weather are challenged during intense heat and can lose their fragile ability to make plans, have good judgment, and effectively care for themselves. These patients are more likely to experience the heat stroke and other climate-related morbidity. Depression interferes with patients' active efforts to protect themselves from heat stroke particularly, or other climate disasters. When our depressed patients bury themselves under stacks of blankets and languish in bed, they ignore and dismiss the early signs of impending deterioration, become confused, and are imprisoned by apathy and hopelessness. The picture on the side is of a psychotic man, and I wonder if you've ever noticed the perplexing sight of psychotic folks all bundled up during hot days and wondered about this. Well, there's actually evidence that schizophrenics can have underlying impairments in thermoregulation that are actually intrinsic to the disease and impair their ability to notice and adequately protect themselves. So if we haven't depressed you enough or concerned you enough, we want to talk about some of the ways that we can engage in actions around as clinicians and healthcare providers in regards to climate change.
Yeah, so I think we'll end on this section, and also open it up to Q&A. There's a variety of things to be said here. There's not only the fact that when we go into a topic like this, as Robin was saying, it's important to know that the risks are not distributed equally, but we are talking about something that both affects us and affects our patient. And so we have to process both of those kind of diagnoses, the one that will affect us and affect our loved ones and affect our communities and affects the lands we love and is already present, but also has a certain amount of uncertainty in the future about what that will look like. And then we also have to understand that we're considering this for our patients. I think a great way to organize how you think you might engage if you're not already engaged, or to open up new avenues of engagement, is a great acronym that was provided by John Coverdale and colleagues in academic psychiatry, which was a call for action for exactly what we're doing here, for more psychiatrists to get involved, get educated. They used this CARE acronym, and we added a second A for advocacy, but it essentially organizes things by the clinical issues you can take up to understand, prevent, and help these impacts. Just knowing the psychoterapeutic syndromes is one, knowing that you're giving thermoregulatory changing medications is another, but there's a host of ones we've already gone over. Administratively, most larger clinic centers and health systems are already trying to green in some way, getting involved in that, even if it doesn't mean necessarily directly in psychiatry, but helping the surgery department use less volatile inhaled anesthetics, which are huge greenhouse gas contributors when they could be using something else. Just cutting down on the amount of plastics that's used throughout different procedures is a great way. And we are already learning to be liaisons and quarterbacks in how we treat the mental health system generally in our collaboration with primary care specialties. I think this is another way to do it. Also, just making sure that you have a disaster preparedness and response plan in your system of care. We're advocacy, calling health policy makers and energy systems to account for how they're preparing to make a transition to a greener, sustainable system, and how they remediate the damage that's already being done. Also a great one, research is very critical. We want to be evidence-based, but there hasn't been a huge push to investigate the mental health impacts of climate change, although I think that is changing more in the public journalistic sphere, but that always will influence the policymakers who can fund epidemiology and direct study of the impacts of various ecological risks. Lastly, education. Part of this webinar is that I want to thank everyone for coming after probably a long day of work or otherwise to learn. And I know it's a lot to take in just 1 hour. We would love to create some more educational standards by which trainees could learn this information. And we're doing that by making a host of presentations to a lot of different psychiatric societies. Lastly, to get involved directly, you should know that Climate Psychiatry Alliance has, been in the making and has really come up to full steam in the past 2 years. We are now advocating for the APA to be part of the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, which has a variety of medical societies signed on and is trying to coordinate all our actions so our voices speak even louder than any one of our professional organizations. Coming to presentations, meeting, webinars, blogs, journals, just reading up yourself, and if you feel moved to contribute, adding something to your local newspaper or your local psychiatric newsletter would be great. Influencing professional leadership, both at the APA, the AMA, and other places. Pushing for, if you know a specialty that's not in the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, going to their website and seeing how they're tackling this issue from a all allied professions perspective is great. And then also pushing the APA specifically, since that's our keep, to divest from fossil fuels. The AMA has already created a plan and they do speak for us, but I would love to see our direct professional representation through the APA create a swift plan to divest from the fossil fuels that is part of their investments. Lastly, luckily this is happening on Earth Day, and in less than a month, the APA 2019 will be happening in San Francisco. I hopefully will see some of you who are on this call there. We have a variety of climate change related topics that we put together. This is a pretty exhaustive list. Unfortunately, they didn't come out with the meeting rooms yet, so I couldn't provide you with the location exactly, but do take a screenshot now and we'll be able to provide this by email later. I'll be speaking on both Sunday and Monday about the healing charms of nature and also how to create sustainable psychiatry solutions for stronger, healthier minds. I know Robin is involved in at least 2 or 3 of these. And join our mailing list at climatepsychiatry.org. Easy to remember, APA is psychiatry.org. We're climatepsychiatry.org. We have a newsletter you can sign on to and just get the ball rolling. It's a very intimidating topic, but this has been just a beautiful organization to be involved in. Even as I'm a psychiatric trainee and oftentimes have to drop off the map, I come back and feel like I'm able to keep clip with what's happening and able to digest the information in a way that feels sustainable professionally and personally, so that we avoid the burnout that happens in a lot of these advocacy pushes. So I just want to welcome you to join us. If you know of other early trainees, I also want to put in a plug for that to get them in touch with me, because I'd love to speak with other trainees who are interested in climate psychiatry.
And I think we have just a few minutes for some questions, so I hope that we're able to address those.
Great. Thank you both so much for a wonderful webinar. I wanted to acknowledge one of the questions that's up here on the Q&A, and attendees, please feel free to add more questions to this. All right, the first question is there research looking at the impact of climate change, thermoregulation, suicide rates, etc., specifically related to trauma disorders such as PTSD? And then they clarify about the pre-existing trauma disorders. Prior question, clearly climate change can cause disorders, as you explained. So again, is there any research looking at the impact of climate change, thermoregulation, suicide rates, etc., specifically related to trauma disorders such as PTSD?
I think that I was implying when I was talking about the impacts on Katrina, that that's a population that has been studied quite extensively in regards to the PTSD response, with huge increase in PTSD. And that's also a population where there were these increases in suicide rates that were not only immediate but delayed. There's also some literature on that specifically in the more recent traumas, climate-related traumas in Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico specifically, what we were seeing early on was an underreporting of the profound impacts, but there was very significant mortality in Puerto Rico, a very profound impact in their communities with PTSD. Many young people fled and older people remained, and there has been a very significant increase in suicide rates in the Puerto Rico. I don't know of any particular literature, and Alex, maybe, I'm not sure if you do or not, that particularly links PTSD and suicide, but the connection and the incidence of increase both of PTSD and of suicide following climate disasters is well documented in the literature.
Yeah, and I think that's why you highlighted the Stanford study focused on a county by county analysis of that connection between temperature and that was temperature, not even over heat waves, just any 1 degree standard deviation centigrade above would increase that. So this puts people at risk even if they don't feel that they're experiencing a heat wave. I think the call for more research relates to the fact that there's so many confounders that we really there's a bunch you can find on this. People just do this biometeorology connection. They get a data set and try to figure out what the local weather was. And I don't trust all those because you have so many confounders to focus on. Like, for example, here, PTSD. Some of the most liberal kind of gun laws are in the states with the highest risk of heat waves. Also states that might have a high veteran population, all these places. So we really highlighted that one because we felt that did a very good job at trying to get a large enough data set and clearly connected on a county by county level with the suicide and not just focused on heat waves, because as we said, that's a very complex issue and has mounting confounders when you just look at a 10-day heat wave.
I have a question, or there's another question or a follow-up to that one. The question is about the effect of climate change on those with pre-existing trauma disorders, in the same way you mentioned the effects on those with depression and psychosis. Thank you to the person posing the question.
So the pre-existing trauma always is a much more significant risk to additional traumas that occur through climate-related disasters. And in my clinical practice, and I treated a number of people who have both have come in with PTSD following some climate-related disasters, or are struggling with the impacts that Alex has more specifically talked about this flood of anxiety about what's happening to the world. Those always are touched upon and contributed to by what people bring to their experience. And earlier traumas are always evoked again by these acute overlays that are related to climate change. So those with a history of trauma are, again, another really vulnerable population.
But I think your anonymous attendee is bringing up a great question. The research is probably not there. If you're a researcher or know someone is, bring them onto this, because, you know, PTSD, we do have one of maybe the best mental health animal models to use, and we could look at you know, amygdala reactivity in different heat strata and things like that. I don't know that that's been done, and then to look directly at humans is also very hard. But it's the paradigm to use with experimental subjects could probably pass an IRB relatively easy. Expose people just a little bit of heat and then see how they cognitively perform, because we know the cognitive alterations in PTSD, other things as well would be very important, because yes, you're mentioning the direct link between psychosis and thermal regulation without the addition of even our psychotropics, and that is an interesting one to explore.
Thank you. And I'll close with another question. There's the concept of seasonal affective disorder, which we've known about for a long time in psychiatry. Do you anticipate there to be some diagnostic changes or something similar to that that relates to climate change?
That's actually an interesting topic, because some of the people that Alex and I work most closely with in our Climate Psychiatry Alliance are doing some thinking about what the way we need to move in terms of codifying some diagnostic thinking and embed in our nosology the impacts of climate change. And I think it's a pretty complex topic to give some thought to. In regards to seasonal affective disorder and this study that was done on Stanford and the heat impacts, those researchers actually postulate the idea that there is some biologically underpinnings to the mood dysregulation during heat exposure, and they think that there very well may be a serotonergic effect. And I think that that might make the link between seasonal affective disorder possibly also. Now that also is an area I think, and Alex would likely agree, that this is ripe for understanding much more deeply and for some new research to look into, because those are just hypotheses that are being considered.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm not necessarily, I don't fall one way or the other on whether we need to push this into DSM territory and study, because I think the variety of ways that climate stress can show up is actually more important than necessarily getting into one syndrome. But there was, on one of the slides I presented on psychotraumatic syndromes, the notion of pre-traumatic stress disorder. That just focuses on the fact that one of the only few diagnoses in the DSM that actually can have a cause, right, is PTSD. It has to have a criteria A, maybe somewhat with bereavement disorder as well. And those two things are interesting. We're talking about a specific cause of mental distress, which is related to earth change generally. And it would have to be a pretty big change, a pretty big leap forward conceptually for us to be able to integrate that into how our current diagnosis and treatment manual. But I think it's not that far off. PTSD is often defined by the fact that the threat is no longer there, and yet this circuitry is activated. But how can we make that assumption for climate? It doesn't necessarily, especially with our prolonged disasters or slow-moving disasters, the stress or the criteria A doesn't disappear. So is that a different type of trauma, or should we subsume it into a diagnosis we already have? I think that's a question to be asked.
Great. Well, Dr. Cooper, Dr. Trope, thank you so much for presenting this evening. I'm also really want to thank our participants for being a part of our first inaugural webinar. As a reminder to our participants that you will get an email with CME information in the coming days. And also there will be a link to the recorded webinar in that email as well. So thank you all again for your participation, and hope you have a wonderful evening and rest of your Earth Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.